Hi, I'm Eric with Simply Elegant Home Cooking. Today I'm going to be showing you my recipe for homemade home-style chicken noodle soup. I like to make this using a roasted chicken. This method takes a little bit longer, but the end results are going to justify all that extra time involved in the cooking process. This is a great cold weather dish, so let me show you how to make it. You'll want to use a 5 to 6 pound roasting chicken and prep the chicken in a very similar manner as you normally would. I've taken this out of the refrigerator a full hour and a half before it's going to go into the oven, rinsed it thoroughly, and patted it dry. We just want to give this a final pat dry, again, before we stuff the cavity. You want to add some salt and pepper to the inside. And then we're going to go in with some aromatics. I have about 10 sprigs of thyme, give or take. You can start by stuffing that in. Several peeled cloves of garlic. And one of the tricks to getting a really moist chicken is to use a lemon cut up into quarters, like so. You probably won't be able to fit the whole lemon in, but you want to get a couple pieces in there. There's half. 3. And I think I actually might be able to get the whole thing in. So I think this bird is at capacity. Now we just need to truss it up. You can just take a little kitchen twine, tie off one leg, and wrap that around. And we're going to cut this extra string in a moment, but what this is going to do, it's going to pull the legs in and prevent these pieces from burning. It's real easy to burn these before the rest of the chicken is fully cooked if you don't take this extra step. Next, we just need to add a little bit of olive oil. You just want to take that and coat all sides of the chicken. And get that nicely coated on the bottom too, and what that's going to do, it's going to prevent sticking in the pan. So get that nice and coated, get the wings and legs. And then the last thing you want to do before we salt the top is you just want to take the wings and fold these over and underneath. And this is going to have a real similar purpose of keeping these from burning, like when we trussed the drumsticks. So that's ready to go. And we can just finish our prep with a little bit of cracked black pepper. You want to put it on pretty liberally. And then go in with a little bit of kosher salt. And once you've sprinkled that on, you just want to use your hands and coat the chicken very evenly. Get the bottom too, a little bit. Just before you put your chicken in the oven, you want to make sure that you have reserved the neck. This is the neck. This is typically going to be found in a little bag inside the chicken with the rest of the giblets. You just want to throw everything else away in that bag. We don't want to use the heart or the liver, but the neck's going to really help add a lot of flavor to the soup. So you want to just put that in the pan too. Our oven has been preheated to 400 degrees. We're ready to put this in. All right, so I have taken the roast chicken out of the oven. This cooked at 400 degrees for an hour and a half. You might need to adjust your cooking time up or down slightly depending on the size of the bird you're using, but this is exactly how you want it to look when you're roasting a chicken for soup. I do take it out a little bit earlier than I ordinarily would versus if I were going to be just serving a regular roast chicken. The reason is there's going to be some residual cooking that goes on when we add this later as we make the soup and put everything together. So what you want to do next is to take the chicken out of the skillet and set that aside like we've done. You'll notice that sometimes the wings can break off. These stuck to the skillet, so I had to pull them off separately, but that's not a big deal. I've left the trussing intact here on the legs. We're going to cut that off later, but while we let this cool for about 30 or 40 minutes, we're going to leave that as is. So what you want to do is just tent that with some foil, set that aside for 30 minutes, and once that's ready, I'll show you the next step. Our chicken has now had 40 minutes to rest and to come down to temperature. I've started by cutting the trussing off. We can now remove this first. And I'll go in a little bit later and make sure I get that whole piece off, but this should allow us to empty out the insides of the chicken. And we're going to take out the lemon, garlic, and thyme. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set the lemon aside. We're going to actually discard that. It served its purpose. So what this did, this infused the chicken with a lot of extra moisture. If you've ever had a roast chicken that's really dried out, this is a great tip I learned actually from my mother to counteract that problem and to keep the chicken moist as you cook it. We're going to set the thyme aside. Throw that out. We're not going to be putting that in the stock. We are going to save this garlic. So you reserve the garlic cloves. That's going to go into the stock. And now we can cut into the chicken and separate the breast meat from everything else. So you can start by carving right down the center to split these breasts off of the bone. And you'll notice the chicken is still really nice and moist. This is right on the cusp of doneness you would want if you were going to eat it. It looks a little bit undercooked, but this is going to go back in the soup, so I'm not worried about the small amount of parts here that look like they might be a little undercooked. It's going to get a little bit more cooking time. So what you can do is you can take off these big pieces of breast meat and set that aside. Cut off your legs. Don't worry at all if you break things up. We're going to be throwing that all in the stock, so it's okay if you have to rip it into a couple pieces. So once you're done separating the breast meat from everything else, it should look a little something like this. You might not have this much. We used a very large chicken today, 6 pounds, so you might have a little less, and that's okay. Now what we're going to do at this point is to take the breast meat, cover this up, and put it in the fridge, and we're going to reserve this to add to the soup later, towards the end of the cooking process. Doing it this way, where you roast the actual breast meat and set it aside to add later to the soup, is going to give you a much more flavorful result. A lot of people cook their soups where they boil the whole chicken for a couple of hours, and what you do when you do it that way is you actually take all of that flavor out of the breast meat. If you've ever had chicken soup and the actual chicken pieces are kind of boring and dull, flavorless, that's what they've done. They've boiled all the flavor out of it. So doing it this method is going to give you a much more flavorful result. So I've taken the rest of the chicken, other than the breast meat. This is going to be the neck, the carcass, the legs, and the wings. And we've thrown it in a 6-quart stock pot. At this point, you want to also add some diced up vegetables. I'm going to go in with 1 whole onion cut up into 4 pieces. And I leave the skins on. There's a lot of flavor. I've also thrown in a couple extra garlic cloves. We have the few that were cooked with the chicken, and I've added a few extra. And I'm also going to take 2 carrots and 2 celery stalks and add that as well. And at this point, we want to add enough water just to cover the chicken, which is going to pretty much fill this pot near capacity. I've added 14 cups of cold water to the stock pot, which is just enough to cover the chicken, but there's really not much excess water in there. You don't want to overload it with too much liquid because that's going to dilute the flavor. Another note, you want to make sure that you always start with cold water. It's going to take a little bit longer to come up to temperature, but it's going to give you a better final result. So once you have your water in the pot, you can turn on the heat. I'm going to turn it to medium and slowly bring that up to temperature. So once this gets to a small simmer, we're going to turn it down and slow cook it for about 4 hours. It's going to take a little bit of time to come up to temperature. So at about this point, you want to really be vigilant as you watch your stock. You'll notice that there's some very small bubbles forming. It's not time to turn the heat down yet, but it doesn't take long at all to go from this state to a rapid boil, and we don't want to let that happen. So you want to make sure at this point that you don't step away, and as soon as the simmer begins, we want to turn the heat down. So it's just going to be another few minutes from this moment. So this is what you're looking for. This is a very, very low simmer. Once I see the stock get to this point, I'm going to turn the heat down. I'm going to turn it all the way down to low, and at this point, still going to have to watch it to adjust. Sometimes you might turn it down a little bit too far, not far enough. So what you want to do is you want to keep making small adjustments until you've maintained this. And eventually you won't need to adjust it. You'll have the heat just right to continue this simmer. And we're going to let it go just like this without touching it, without stirring it or doing anything for 4 hours. The one thing you might need to do is to add a little bit more water. In this case, there's about an inch from the water level to the top. If that reduces, I'll add a little bit as it cooks. But we're going to let it go completely untouched at this very gentle simmer that you see now for the remainder of the cooking time. So I actually forgot one small step earlier. There's one other thing you want to do as your stock cooks periodically. You'll notice that there's a little bit of foam, a little bit of particles and bits of fat that float to the top. You just want to go in with a wire spoon like this and just every now and then take some of those out of there. It's not really going to matter too much because we are going to be straining this out, but this will help you get an even clearer result with your stock. So we are now 4 hours into the process of cooking the stock, and it's ready at this point. You'll notice that the water has actually gone down a little bit. I did in the last hour to let a little bit of the liquid evaporate out, and I've also gone in already with the spoon just around the edges ever so slightly like that to remove any small amount of fat. The way we cook this chicken separately, roasting it separately, that actually gets rid of the majority of the fat. That was all going to be contained in the cast iron skillet, so there was a very small amount to skim out, which I've done. So at this point, I'm going to turn off the heat. And we're ready to strain this out. What you want to do is you want to strain it through either a fine mesh strainer or a cheesecloth, and then we'll be ready to start putting the soup together. So our stock's ready and has been set aside. It's now time to saute the vegetables. I have over medium heat about 1.5 tablespoons of butter, and I'm going to add in the vegetables. So I've just added about 2 carrots diced up, 2 stalks of celery, and half of an onion. And what we want to do is just give that a good mix. We're going to let this cook for about 5 minutes just until the onions start to become translucent. And one other ingredient, we're going to add just a pinch of fresh thyme. So I'm going to stir that in and we'll check back in about 5 minutes. The vegetables have now been sauteing for about 6 minutes and they're ready to add to the soup. You want to make sure that you don't cook them too long because these are going to cook for an additional 10 or 15 minutes as we put the soup together and bring that to a boil. So you want to stop short of how you want them to actually taste in the finished product. So the vegetables are now added to the stock, and I'm going to crank the heat all the way up to high, and we're going to wait till this comes to a boil. The soup has now come to a rapid boil, and at this point you want to add a little bit of salt. And we're ready to add in our egg noodles. Now this is the type I like. You don't necessarily have to use this brand, but if you can find egg noodles that are marked as homemade noodles that look kind of like this, they're going to taste a lot better than the standard egg noodles that most people buy at the grocery store. This is a 12-ounce package. You want to make sure you don't use too much. I'm going to use about between 1/3 and half of this package. You want to use about 4 to 6 ounces, so I'm going to pour those in now. So I've added a little bit less than half the package. According to the package instructions, these take 12 to 15 minutes to cook. They take quite a while to cook, so you'll have to gauge with whatever kind of noodles you want to monitor them, make sure that you cook them to the right doneness. So we're going to stir this up and let this go. The egg noodles are now about halfway cooked, and at this point you want to add back in the reserved chicken. everything a nice stir. And this will need to cook for about another 7 minutes and it'll be ready. The egg noodles have now been cooking for a full 15 minutes and they're ready. So at this point you can turn off the heat. And I'm going to add one final ingredient. I'm going to add a quarter teaspoon of turmeric. This is optional, but it's going to really improve the color. It's going to improve the appearance of the soup. It's going to maybe have a small impact on the flavor, but not much. But it's actually a very healthy spice to consume. So if you have this, I would definitely throw it in, but you probably don't need to run to the store to pick it up to make this recipe. So go in there with a quarter teaspoon and just give this a stir. And we're ready to serve this up. Here's how your soup should look once you're complete and have served it up. What makes this soup so unique is that everything in it tastes the way it's supposed to taste. The chicken tastes like chicken, the carrots taste like carrots, the celery tastes like celery. The way a lot of people make their chicken soup where they just boil it all together for a number of hours, that's going to extract all that flavor and it's left tasting very bland. This method avoids all of that. It's very labor intensive, but the end results are worth it. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you give it a try. Give me a like and a subscribe, and I'll be seeing you again soon. Thank you.